welcome, and this is your, I guess, your last stop of the first session in the morning, and then you kind of break off your groups. I'm Christy Sprague. I'm a weed scientist here at Michigan State University, and today I'm going to talk about some of the things we've been looking at in both sugar beets and dry beans for weed control. And the biggest thing I want to mention today is water hemp. How many people know what water hemp is? How many people have seen water hemp in your fields? Or maybe not yours. You don't have to mention yours. Neighbors. Neighbors' fields. They're always in neighbors' fields, right? So, water hemp. So this is actually a water hemp plant, okay? I'm going to tell you it's a male plant because I don't want Paul accusing me of spreading water hemp all over the Bean and Beet farm. So this is a male water hemp plant. Water hemp is a pigweed species, so a lot of times, you know, it's been pretty hard to tell the difference between that particular species and some of our native pigweed species like Powell amaranth or redroot pigweed. Another pigweed that we have to worry about is Palmer amaranth, but that really hasn't taken off as much as what we've seen with water hemp. And I would say the last 3 to 5 years, we've really started to see this weed take off in a lot of fields.
How do you know that's a male?
How do I know that's a male? So if you look at it, you'll see that it kind of looks a little fluffy up there. And if you go like this, you're going to see pollen come out. So unfortunately, until the seed head comes out, you don't know if it's a male or female. So the female one will look very similar, except for it's not going to have like these, you can see kind of this white. And it's going to be, once the pollen flows to the female, then it's fertilized and then we get seed, okay? So one of the things that, because it has male and female plants, one of the things that happens is you get a lot of crossing and genetic diversity. And I think that's why this particular weed species has been able to develop resistance to all sorts of different kinds of herbicides. So there are some states in the U.S. where we have resistance in one population to about 6 different herbicides. In Michigan right now, a majority of the water hemp plants that we have are resistant to glyphosate, and they're also resistant to the ALS inhibitors. So like if you think of in dry beans, Raptor, that's one of them, or Pursuit, or Harmony in soybeans, so some of those different ALS inhibitors. The other thing that I do want to mention is we have seen in Michigan, particularly in the last year, there are a couple fields where PPO resistance has occurred. And when I'm talking about the PPO herbicides, I'm talking about things like Reflex that we would use in dry beans, or something like FlexStar, Ultra Blazer, or Cobra that we might use in soybeans. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's not widespread across Michigan, but we have a couple fields. And if you go to some of the other states like Illinois, they are seeing widespread resistance to those particular herbicides. So the herbicide resistance is one of the things that makes it very difficult to control. The other thing that makes it really difficult to control is it continues to come up throughout the season. It usually starts a little bit later. We see water hemp coming up usually the last couple weeks of May. So it's not an early emerger. It usually comes up later in the season, and then it continues to come up. And if you drive around right now, all of a sudden you start looking at some soybean fields and you see a few weed escapes, you might be looking at water hemp, because that's one that's really starting to come on pretty strong in the last week or so. So just kind of keep an eye out as you're driving by your fields, and if you start to see something coming up above that canopy, it could be water hemp. So one of the other things I want to mention about water hemp, again, it is a pigweed species. It has male and female plants, but one of the ways to tell water hemp apart from some of the other pigweeds is to look at the stem. And the stem is going to be, it's not going to be hairy. There's not going to be any hairs on it. With our native pigweed species, it is a little bit rough and fuzzy. So if you feel this, it's smooth. There's no hair on it. The other thing to look at is the leaf. And the leaves typically are a little bit longer and they're glossy. Okay? So it's a little bit different than the other pigweed species that we have. If we had Palmer amaranth, which is the other one we need to worry about, the leaf is a little bit wider. The other thing, this petiole right here on the leaf, if you fold it over on the leaf, if you had Palmer, this petiole would be as long as the leaf or longer. And that's the key way to tell the difference between those two. Again, they're both going to have smooth stems. So this is one of those weeds where it's really been a challenge to control, and it's really been a challenge in pretty much all the crops, and we're really starting to see it move into more of the sugar beet area, as well as showing up in some dry beans. So over the last couple years, we've been trying to look at some different ways to control this particular weed. And one of the things that makes it really challenging in both of those those crops is we don't have a lot of herbicide options. So if you think about in sugar beets, what do we have? We have Roundup, right? What other herbicides do we have that we can use? Stinger, right? Warrant. What else? Dual, right? Outlook. So Warrant, Dual, and Outlook, those are all what we consider kind of residual herbicides that do not have any post-emergence activity. So when we apply those herbicides, we need to make sure that the weed is not up. So if all of a sudden water hemp starts to come up and we apply Dual, Warrant, or Outlook, it's not going to control it. It's only going to control the ones that haven't emerged yet. So that really becomes an issue when we look at sugar beets, because what do we have post-emergence that'll control it? Because Stinger doesn't work very well, and we just don't really have a lot of post-herbicides. What we've been working on the last couple of years is to see if we can use maybe some of the herbicides that we might have in other crops. And one of the things we've been looking at is Ultra Blazer. So this last year we got a Section 18 for Ultra Blazer, just basically as an emergency use. And that was to control water hemp that would have already emerged at the time. We're trying to do some different things to try to control it in some of those fields. The bad thing about Ultra Blazer is you get a lot of injury. It's a burner. So if you apply Ultra Blazer to your sugar beets, you're going to see a lot of injury. And it's one of those things where you pretty much want to walk away for about 2 to 3 weeks, because if you look at it 7 days later, you thought, oh boy, I killed those beets. And this year, even though I've done this for about 5 years, this year I came back about a week later and I thought, oh, I did it this time. I really killed them. Came back 10 days later and they started looking a lot better. So it's one of those things, they look really rough.
How does it affect the yield?
So that's a great question. So we've looked at this for, I think this will be the 4th or 5th year. When we've applied it early at the 2-leaf stage, we've taken out some stand. If we wait till the 6-leaf stage, we have not seen any reductions in yield. And that's for the last 4 years that we've applied it. We also have that trial out here this year that will be taken to yield to see how that affects it. One of the things with the Section 18 is the Section 18 is for using 1 pint of Ultra Blazer with a glyphosate and an AMS, or using Ultra Blazer with a non-ionic surfactant. We've looked at other things where we've added things like asmetolachlor. In the case of this study, we looked at a moccasin product. We've looked at Warrant. We've looked at Outlook. We've looked at different tape mixtures with ethylfumicate. We've looked at using a methylated seed oil, a crop oil. Every time we see an increase in injury, and in the past, in our studies in the past, some of those mixtures have also resulted in reduced yield. So right now, where we're at is just using Ultra Blazer either with Roundup or by itself. We've continued to look at potentially having 2 applications, and maybe we'll be able to get that in the future, because we know with Ultra Blazer, we're really trying to control water hemp when it's 4 inches tall or less. Most of the time when we notice we have water hemp, how tall is it? 1 foot, 2 foot, and it's just not going to be that effective. In general, Ultra Blazer only gets us about 80% control, but I guess it's better than nothing. So that's kind of where we're at. One of the other concerns that we do have is with the potential for herbicide resistance, because again, we have that PPO resistance. Thank you. So, you know, that's kind of our fallback. You didn't know you had water hemp, and all of a sudden you see water hemp coming up in your field. That's our option. The other thing that we're trying to do is think about being proactive. So being proactive, we want to be thinking about using things like Dual, Outlook, or Warrant to get some residual out there so that we're getting control before that water hemp comes up. And if we know that we have a field where we potentially could have some water hemp, we can do some split applications, and we've been looking at that for the last couple of years. Another thing that we've done is this last year was able to get a 24C for a pre-emergence application of a half a pint of dual tube magnum or dual magnum to get us some residual control early before we can actually make that full rate application of dual outlook or warrant. And that's really what this study is kind of looking at that to see if we have any issues with herbicide injury or yield loss, and that's kind of the focus of that particular trial. So we've got a lot of split applications, and we have this same trial at a water hemp site. And one of the things that we've looked at is water hemp control, and I would tell you this year for our water hemp control, our best control has come if we've had dual applied at a half pint early, or using ethofumicate at 3 pints, and then following it up with an application of warrant at around that 2-leaf stage of sugar beets. And that application would be with Roundup. So we've got that overlapping effect. We also had very similar control with Outlook at 16 ounces at that 2-leaf stage when we had dual pre. And then we've also did it where we've come back with warrant at a 3-pint rate at the 2-leaf stage, and then another 3-pint rate at 6-leaf, and then warrant followed by dual, and have had really good control with all 3 of those programs. I would tell you that our water hemp site we planted later, so we're closer to the time when water hemp would emerge, and that's really where that dual helps out from that pre side. If you're planting typically early, like early April, maybe that pre-herbicide you don't really need. It's just making sure that you get those residuals out there before the water hemp comes up. The other thing that we've looked at is trying to control this weed in dry beans. So one of the things we've tried to do is kind of go after that same type of situation where we can overlap some of the residual herbicides. And right now, the only residual herbicide that has a early post label is Outlook. And you can apply Outlook up to 21 ounces either at the V1 to the V3 stage of dry beans. And what we've done is really looked at some of the split applications. And that would be putting 11 ounces out pre, and then coming back at about V2, V3 with the additional 10 ounces of Outlook. So we have that overlapping residual to get us that water hemp control through the season. Because generally when we plant dry beans, water hemp is going to be emerging. The other thing that we've done is we've, with those splits, we've tank mixed it with something like Reflex, because we do know we still get good reflex or control with Reflex. And by adding that 11 ounces of Outlook to that Reflex application, we can control any of the water hemp that has escaped with the Reflex, and then we get that residual control out. Because again, that kind of just gives us that barrier for any of the water hemp that would come up. So we've looked at those split applications with Reflex by itself, we've looked at it with Varisto by itself, and we've looked at it with a combination of Reflex plus Varisto. If we look at, so Varisto again is Raptor Basagran. If we look at, we've also looked at Dual 2 Magnum and Warrant, even though those are not labeled post-emergence in dry beans. So we wanted to see if we could do the same thing. In general, we've had decent control with Reflex, but by about 60 days after treatment, because of new emergence, we see about 61% control. So that's really where those overlapping applications of including Outlook help. And in the case of applying Outlook with Reflex, post-emergence with that 10-ounce rate of Outlook, we've had 96% control of water hemp. So that's worked really well. And again, we've had very similar results with some of the other herbicides that are not yet labeled. If we don't have a pre and we decide to just put the full shot on post-emergence, we've had about 81 to 86% control. So if we apply 1 pint of Reflex with 21 ounces of Outlook at the V3 stage, we're still getting pretty good control. It's not 100%, but it looks pretty good. So that's kind of what we've been looking at to try to manage water hemp in some of our, with sugar beets and dry beans, which is a little bit tougher to control. The other thing I do want to mention is we're getting really close to the time when we're going to be applying some of our desiccation treatments in dry beans. And just as a quick review, we currently have 4 herbicides that can be used as desiccation treatments for dry beans. Those are Gramoxone, Sharpen, Valor, and AIM. The timing for those applications generally are when we have about 80% of the pods are yellow. There's a little bit of differences in pre-harvest treatment or intervals for each one of those herbicides, but I would tell you in general, most of the time it takes about 7 days for all of them to reach their maximum desiccation. Some of the PHIs are shorter. For example, Sharpen has a 2-day and Valor has a 5-day. They all act relatively fast. There are some rotation restrictions, which I'll point out in a minute. We generally have good to excellent control of or desiccation of dry beans with Gramoxone, Sharpen, either at 1 or 2 ounces. And in general, we've never seen much of a difference between the 1 or 2 ounce rate. When we're looking at 1 or 2 ounces of Sharpen, one thing I do want to point out is that the rotation restrictions are different. This year we had some growers that decided they were going to plant dry beans after dry beans, which and they use Sharpen as a desiccant. Because of the drier weather and the higher use rate of Sharpen that we used, there were some fields where we did see some stand loss because of that. With Sharpen, if you use 1 ounces, you need 4 months without frozen ground to either plant sugar beets or dry beans. If you use the 2 ounce rate, you're looking at 5 months, and again, that's without frozen ground. And also you need to have that moisture. In general, we're not recommending going dry beans after dry beans, but if you were going to do that, you're safer going with that 1 ounce rate than the 2 ounce rate, and it's the same thing for sugar beets. When we think about weeds, one of the things we had some control issues with lamb's quarters this year. The only herbicide that'll get us some good desiccation of lamb's quarters is going to be Gramoxone, which can be an issue because, again, this is a restricted use pesticide. There are some newer certifications that you need to get if you're going to be using that. You can get those certifications online. It's about an hour tutorial, and then you take a test, and then you're certified for 3 years. So just one thing to keep in mind. And in general, when we've done a lot of mixtures, 1 ounce of Sharpen with Gramoxone, methylated seed oil, and AMS have been excellent for dry bean desiccation, as well as desiccating some of the weeds like lamb's quarters, pigweed, and so forth. If you don't have lamb's quarters as an issue, Sharpen at the 1 ounce rate does a pretty good job of desiccating some of the pigweeds, ragweed, and also mare's tail.